Jason Miles is the co-host of This Is Revolution podcast. And let's talk about love, King, and the perils of police reform. Last week, we were talking about the 30th anniversary of the LA riots.
Mm-hmm.
And after the riots, there were calls for more police transparency and greater representation of minorities on the police force. We're seeing it in Cleveland. Cleveland, I think, has done the best job so far not after the 92 riots, but after the reaction to the George Floyd murder. They've done a pretty good job.
As far as what?
A civilian police board. They voted in November, where civilians and police will serve on a review board, but they can't be police from Cleveland. They have to be retired police officers from another city.
So retired police officers are going to serve on a board to do what?
To handle police brutality.
That sounds like a horrible idea.
All right. I when I read about it, I'm probably misrepresenting it. It's one of the most progressive.
That police. Sounds the most like. Why would I want ex-cops to handle cops?
Well, they also have, but I also believe they have public defenders sitting on the review board. It's not just cops; it's civilians and lawyers who have spent their careers defending. Not being prosecutors, defense attorneys.
Well, I guess the other question is, how much power do you really have? Because there's tons of cities that have those boards. We had one in Oakland for a long time. I believe there was one in LA. It's all about how much power you have. And, I think there's a disconnect when it comes to rhetoric and power. So even if you look at community policing, like, okay, we're going to move a cop into an area. I think it's Illinois or maybe it's Chicago, where they actually have a cop that stays in a house that's in the city that they walk a beat in. So if you think about, this is my whole beef with reform. If you're not changing the material conditions that make police necessary, you're not going to ever do anything, because you're always going to have an other. Always. And the police are going to always form a bit of a class of their own. And they're going to look at the people they police as other, not as fellow citizen, not as brother or sister, but as other, because you are a problem. You are a blight. You are affecting capital. So the idea that I'll get nicer cops, I'll get blacker cops, I'll get gayer cops, I'll get trans cops, doesn't mean anything. You are still law enforcement. The CIA recently had a tweet or a Facebook post or both where they were in solidarity for missing and murdered Indigenous women's hashtag. And jokingly, one of the people in our TIR chat said, I wonder which ones they had missing or murdered. So it's almost insane to think of reform, because the reforms that you're talking about were called for in 1965. They were called for in 1992. And then you hear about it again in 2014 with Trayvon Martin, and you hear about it again in 2020. In 1991, Rodney King's butt kicking by the police doesn't even make the front page of the LA Times. It isn't until CNN, hungry for that 24-hour-a-day catnip that they had with the Iraq invasion. Once they get their hands on that tape, they're like, oh, we got it again. It's just endless content for them. And the conversation is constantly about race. But even in 1990, the racial makeup of the Los Angeles Police Department mirrored that of the city. Almost 40% of it was minority. And even now it's even more. But we never talk about the economics. We never talk about the makeup of the city. As you know, LA isn't like New York. It's very spread out. There's areas of it that are more prosperous than others. They actually have a very affluent Black upper middle class, and even part of the ruling class, not right next to, but not too far away from historically one of the most poor areas for Black people in the country. So it's a very polarizing area. And you can't just put your finger on one thing and say, this one thing is the problem. But one thing we can get back to is the fact that there are these material conditions that, while not addressed, you'll always have a need for law enforcement. Before Rodney King, and I'm sure you remember this, I know you remember this, all the talk was gang violence. Gangs, crack, crack, crack. People like Ishmael Reed, prominent Black intellectuals, activists like Ishmael Reed, called Black drug dealers in the 80s Black fascists. He's not a right winger. This is a real deal leftist, ex-Panther, calling Black drug dealers Black fascists. This is how we looked at crime in this era. After the Rodney King videotape gets shown ad nauseum, it totally changes the way we talk about problems in the community to now they're all police problems. And police were a problem. They definitely were a problem. But as someone that actually grew up in an area where I literally did have to dodge bullets, and I've been shot at, and I've had...
You were shot at?
Yeah. And I've had people close to me murdered. I do understand that there's, as Joe Biden says, very bad dudes. Right. But I also know how repressive and authoritarian police can be in neighborhoods like I grew up in. But as long as you have the neighborhood like I grew up in, you're always going to have police. Sorry.
The new right-wing talking point about stricter sentencing guidelines and crack carrying more time than cocaine is... It was the Black leadership that came to Washington and said, we're being devastated by crack cocaine. Can you have some sentencing guidelines that lock these dealers up and users up for life so we can save our children? Is there any truth to that? Because you'll hear that from Republicans, that why is the Black community blaming white people for these strict sentencing guidelines?
Yes and no. And at first, I'll try to be brief because I know
that's okay.
First and foremost, we have to remember that crack doesn't appear out of the ether and destroy a community. And if you ever want to explain capitalism to someone, I think there's no better way to do it than explain the blow up of crack. So after the fall, go ahead.
Okay, we've covered Freeway Ricky and we've talked about how the CIA and Oliver North.
Ignore that. Get away from that.
Well,
that's conspiracy. But hold on.
I agree with. I think
the CIA definitely we'll get into that.
Gary Sick was that. So who was the author of the San Jose Mercury?
Gary Webb.
Gary Webb went a
little too far, in my opinion. So as the government is allowing the flow of cocaine from Mexico to LA, one thing you never really hear, and sometimes you hear about it, and some of the people that talk about it, is that cocaine is cheaper as it's coming from Mexico straight to LA, opposed to when it was coming from Florida all the way over. And number two, the gangs that are already there are a built-in distribution network for your drugs. And what the gangs are finding is freebase cocaine is cheaper and more potent. And now the poor and middle class that were kept out of, the ability to get cocaine, because cocaine's a popular drug at the time. It's on the cover of Time magazine as a wonder drug. Now you have access to it, and you have a built-in distribution network in the gangs. So if you think about a kilo, well, let's just make up some numbers, and 79.80 costing you $3,000 to $5,000, you can now rock that kilo up and maybe turn it into $35,000 to $50,000. And you already have a built-in distribution network to get this out. One big reason why this happens isn't just because it's flowing in, it's because it's taking the place of all of these good factory jobs that used to be in LA.
Right.
By this time, if the jobs haven't left the state altogether, they've definitely left the area. And you already had a certain amount of citizens that came over in this very large migration from the South that didn't get jobs, that were living on government assistance. Reagan gets into office, and incrementally, he's trying to dismantle a lot of the welfare programs that we have. He even wants to get to the right of Milton Friedman. So you start to see the welfare queen rhetoric in like the early 70s with Reagan, and he starts to do little incremental welfare reforms. Then he eventually gets into the presidency, and they're a little larger. And then by the time Clinton gets in office, he takes all that rhetoric and just totally doubles down on it. But, now we're past the 92 riots. But even getting up to that point, you also have to take into inflationary spending. You have a population that is not part of the tax base. So you have a kind of a failing tax base. So when we look at municipal...
You also have a racist president, Ronald Reagan, who would sell weapons to the Iranians, at the time our enemy. We would sell weapons to the Iranians illegally to get illegal cash to give to the Contras, who were led by one of their leaders was the agricultural minister of Nicaragua. When he was under Somoza, he knew all the cocaine dealers, and he Blandon, I think is his name, and he worked with Blandon to get cocaine into the ghetto.
But why?
To fund, partly to fund the Contras.
Or I shouldn't say why, but how? Because it's an open air drug market where you can deliver the product freely.
Right.
So I'm never going to deny the fact that there is a kind of a free way, if you will, for drugs to flow.
In my limited time, so with the police, I doubt the African-American leadership in America, well, who knows? A lot of them probably did know that the CIA was dumping crack into urban
Don't
areas.
say that. They were dumping cocaine. When you say crack, you're assuming that they were literally rocking up cocaine and dumping it. That wasn't what it was. It was the free flow of cocaine. Crack then comes from the ingenuity of young people. I hate that. Never underestimate the power of capitalism. And that's what we're doing right now. We're underestimating capitalism, and we're making it a conspiracy theory. This is capitalism. Here's some cocaine.
It came into America as cocaine. You said that earlier.
Yes.
Because nobody had a factory job.
Someone said it, thank you, Ann Lee, just like meth. Why do you think meth blows up in deindustrialized sectors of the Midwest and the South? Because it's cheap to manufacture. You already have a built-in base. It's capitalism. It's replacing an industry.
Interesting.
And that's how it should be viewed, not as just the evil of white men. If we constantly look at these things as the evil of white men, then we'll constantly be trying to figure out how to make white men less evil. That seems like a waste of time to me, especially when you have a capitalism problem.
Right, right. But in terms of the police, do you think the police knew they must have known where the cocaine was coming from, right?
Did they care? I mean, they knew, but it's one of those things. It's like, this just happens, and it blew up because no one knew. I'm never of the assumption that all these things people just know, and there's a magical wizard like Oz pulling strings. And cocaine blew up in a way that no one really knew how to handle it. And the problem with the way cocaine blew up is that the conversations around it stayed very racialized. So it was either Moynihan-esque, it's the defectiveness of Black people in single parent households that's leading to this crime problem, which to a certain degree was doubled down by certain Black intellectuals. I mean, hell, watch movies like Boys in the Hood. It's kind of Moynihan-esque in that whole, look at the kids with no dad. They sure didn't turn out right. And the kid that had a dad turned out just fine.
You're talking about Patrick Moynihan when he worked for Nixon and talked about benign neglect of the African American communities. He's a Democrat.
Yeah, he worked for LBJ. Yeah.
I thought he worked for Nixon.
That came out during the Great Society programs during Nixon. That's the whole the Black family.
But was he as bad? I thought he was making a point when he said that.
Yeah, he's saying that it's the defectiveness of these people, and that gets doubled down on by the bell curve. Charles Murray's The Bell Curve, that it's the defectiveness of this Negro mind that's going to kind of keep it impoverished, and they're going to need special programs. So when you think of the CIA put crack in the community, it's almost as if capitalism doesn't exist, and there's just a mysterious other that's pulling these strings. And there were several people in the Black community that were faced with a two-headed problem. You have overzealous law enforcement that's very, very heavy-handed. And you have a gang problem that is killing people left and right. In 1986, there were 187 homicides in LA County. By the next year, you have 387. So you're seeing the numbers go up. So there is no make-believe, but it's just the solutions people are trying to find are kind of coming off of this idea of, well, if we give more time, if we're more punitive in our sentencing, then that'll get the bad guys off the street. If we criminalize the users and give harder sentences to the dealers, then that will fix this problem in our area. And no one really wanted to address the economic problems. That was never part of the conversation. And if you even go back and look at conversations that were had during that time, it's just strictly racial grievance over and over again. And the only people having economic conversations, people like Milton Friedman and his acolytes.
Right. To be continued. Hopefully you can come back Thursday. I love talking to you. I know you will.
Hopefully I will.
You tape your show on Thursdays, and you said some things that really, you took me in a direction that I thought I was familiar with, and then you said some things that blew me away about how crack is manufactured. I appreciate it. Jason Miles is the co-host of This Is Revolution podcast. Go listen to the This Is Revolution podcast right now and support the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Thank you.